Alright, why does it take an hour to finish one round in 5th edition combat? This is a big question. The problem is not simple, but in the initially short video I had planned initially for 2 weeks ago, I found one answer that we can fix probably in the next few minutes. Spoiler alert, it's not your players, it's not even your DMing, it's a little bit of initiative, saving throws, sure, but the biggest problem is something neither you nor the players had control over. The monsters of 5th edition have too many hit points. Howdy folks, Gelatinous Rube here. This video is probably going to be, well, I said it was going to be short. That turned out to be a lie, but regardless, I'm going to front load it with my advice so y'all can fix your 5th edition campaigns right off the bat. If you are fielding a creature in 5th edition of CR 7 or below, they almost certainly should not have more than 50 hit points. If they are a humanoid of CR 7 or below, they absolutely should not have more than 50 hit points. Now, if you folks want my personal guide for how to reorient 5th edition's hit points, you can find it at patreon.com/RubeJelly, but that's just to expedite the process of bringing the game in line with my carefully designed vision. But if y'all want to do it on your own, I'm sure y'all will fare just fine. And speaking of which, go on right ahead and subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell, else you might miss our videos in the future. But if y'all want a quick fix, here it is. Do not deploy a monster with more hit points than 10 times its CR. Alright, caveats. If the monster is meant to be a boss, meaning they're the focus of a battle with minions, you could increase these hit points by about half. If the monster is a real, genuine monster and has a damage output that outpaces its hit points, you can probably ignore this rule as well. That exception is pretty much just made for dragons, but anyways, let's dive into the math and my decision-making process. Let's see if y'all can reverse engineer my Patreon process or come up with your own. We're going to discuss why I think 5th edition's bloated hit points make combat boring by virtue of making it slow, why it makes combat slow by way of making it boring, the threat incentives involved in making slower or faster combat, and finally get to some exceptions. We're gonna start with the reasoning behind my adjustments. Low-level creatures have both low damage and low 2-hit bonuses, and the hit points, and more importantly the armor class of player characters, rapidly increase, rapidly outpace them. But the characters don't necessarily stop fighting these creatures, right? Grix, orcs, bandits, sprites, these don't just disappear just because your players leveled up. So how does the game compensate? Increasing 2-hit bonuses is tied to way too many other statistics to change. Increasing damage is too risky to low-level characters, so the designers got their heads together and thought, what if we didn't give the monsters more damage, or make them more likely to hit? What if we just gave the monsters more opportunities to roll attacks? Well, that sounds fine in theory until your players hit an 18 armor class. Then the gargoyle with a +4 bonus to hit and 1d6 damage doesn't look so good. They have an okay chance to hit, sure, but what's the gargoyle's chance of never hitting? What are the chances the gargoyle never rolls a 14 before bonuses? If you had your players roll attacks versus nothing, literally nothing, and told them they couldn't move to the next room until they hit 60 damage, it would be faster than running combat with low-level enemies. Just make your players take damage every round. It'll be more effective than using gargoyles, bandits, you name it. Nothing screams slog like seeing 10 enemies the players know take at least 3 hits to bring down a piece, but are never gonna get a shot in themselves. Now sure, some of the players do have spells, but consider this. What if they never use those spells? The enemy isn't going to hit anyways. Why would you use your precious spells when you could just spam cantrips every round? Say the enemy does hit once or twice, you saved your spells. Now you can use those spell slots to heal. This is obviously more efficient for your hit points, your spell slots, your recoverable resources overall. Every element of the game your incentives interact with, except one. time. This process takes ages. It is a waste. I'll give you folks an example. One of my players in the Gelatinous Valley campaign loved to use plant growth to slow down enemies. He would place the areas of plant growth in a checkerboard-style fashion, slowing larger enemies to a crawl if they did try to advance. The players could then use ranged attacks to gun the enemy down. Awesome, except it takes too long. Now, the one or two players responsible might not care that much, but it's boring for pretty much everyone else. Multiple players asked for the spells to not be used. Players came to me in DMs and asked me to ban the spell when that didn't work. Now, Gelatinous Valley uses one-to-one time to discourage this exact behavior. If one day passes in-game for every day that passes in real life, then taking 4 hours to complete one combat is a terrible idea. Bad gaming, bad player, but this, believe it or not, made the problem worse. One player could slow down combat to a crawl, sabotaging every single other player in the game as a result. AD&D's timekeeping rules are great, don't get me wrong, but they're not a panacea. They don't solve every problem. If I wanted to treat this issue at its source, creatures could not be allowed to last more than 2 or 3 rounds of direct combat with my players. Now, we shouldn't just be worried about the impact of high hit points on the speed of combat overall. Believe it or not, poorly designed game elements can change how your players perceive time, can change how they perceive the game's progress. Taking actions in the game. You know what? Think about the language that we use for activity in-game. Action. Something is happening. Changes on the screen of your players' minds. Taking an action is supposed to make the scenario different from when it began. We'll take a combat example. We'll say that you and your friend are facing off against a tough enemy while your party tries to keep the minions from arriving. Your character moves to the right and behind the enemy. They're now sandwiched between 2 fighters. The remaining enemies are on the other side of the room. Can our heroes kill their target before reinforcements arrive? That's a great bit of tension. The combat has urgency as a result of their choices, but the target has 150 hit points. The players already know that the enemy will arrive. They know if they want this bad guy dead, they have to spend the next 3 rounds at least wailing on him, probably with the same basic attacks over and over again. The monster might have enough damage and a high enough 2-hit bonus to knock a player out. That'll kick tension back into the encounter, but here's the problem. The minions on the other side of the room have enough hit points to tank damage too. They're just as likely to last 3 rounds, so they can afford to take attacks of opportunity and rush in to support their boss. The party's choice to split up and try to lock down the encounter boss didn't matter, so you could say, well, it's a boss, of course it has 150 hit points, of course it's supposed to last longer than everything else. But the encounters, the way the math works out, is that the minions, because they have too many hit points, also get there in time. They're also always free to basically do what they please. It doesn't really matter on a round-to-round basis what the players do to impact the minions' actions, if that makes sense. And let me make this clear, if your players know not just the outcome, but every single action and roll they're gonna have to make for the next 3 rounds, that's boring. There's no good reason to get really invested in combat in a situation like this. Yes, there is set dressing, there are more tactical monsters you can maybe deploy, there are higher damage outputs to threaten your players, sure. But if you find yourself always compensating for the same exact problem over and over and over again, perhaps the problem can be solved at its source. So like I said, I don't mind if bosses have some extra staying power, can escape being locked down, or have a conditional way of healing themselves. Those don't bother me. What bothers me is when gameplay is flattened, when all combats resemble the same exact slog because your only win condition is to smack a slightly more threatening, slightly more responsive training dummy around until it stops getting back up. The game as a whole flattens the same kind of experience. When the players can anticipate the same exact experience time and time again, it gets boring. And when the game gets boring, it gets slow. Let's take a completely different game to compare and contrast, because if we figure out why a different game excels in a given field or mode of play, it might illuminate a more general or universal principle of game design. Lancer is a game focused on piloting mechs in a post-utopian interstellar society. Your pilot gains licenses as they level, expanding your access to different frames, systems, and weapons. It's a very tactical, very fast-paced game that rewards teamwork. Now, it takes a lot to kill your pilot in these games. Many of the enemies you'll face also have some pretty substantial staying power, so why is it that this game gets heralded as a successor to 4th edition with all the fun bits of combat? Well, Lancer did two things right. First, it scaled its hit points way down. Most hit points are in the double digits, just barely, and really not beyond that. But second, the game added a statistic called structure. Structure makes bad things happen to your mech when you go below 0 hit points. You then regain your hit points and you lose 1 structure. In exchange, you might lose a special system for hacking, or your grenades might misfire, your gun's barrel could warp beyond safe use. The Lancer devs knew that they didn't want player characters to die instantly on breaching 0 hit points, but bloating hit points as a stopgap would just lead to a kind of arms race between player characters and monsters in which some character options or challenges to players would just naturally fall behind. This principle applies to bosses. We'll circle back to these mechanics later. Alright, so let's tie together all of our claims into something a little bit more coherent before we move on. First up, I think the game designs low-level monsters to be ineffective the moment random chance is skewed against them, and I gave the following tidbits of information about 5th edition to support my claim. Low-level monsters are supposed to be encountered at most levels of play. Skeletons and bandits never really go out of style. These monsters have low 2-hit bonuses. When they do hit, they deal little damage. These low-level monsters typically only have attacks to deal damage. I then said that I think game masters are incentivized to inflate the hit points of low-level critters over other statistics. If the GM wants the players to fight low-level creatures, they need to compensate for their lack of challenge. If the GM adds a lot of monsters, most of them get wiped out without dealing damage, wasting a lot of time in setup. Increasing the monster's 2-hit bonuses by the book increases several other statistics, like strength or dexterity or proficiency bonus, producing an unintended logistic growth and challenge. Increasing damage just produces random, inconsistent spikes of damage that can still result in monsters dealing no damage across a fight, but can also outright kill the party in as little as a round of lucky rolls. Also undesirable. So the GM chooses to increase hit points instead to provide a smoother curve of challenge by giving monsters more chances to deal their low damage. Now I claim that players react to these unthreatening but beefy creatures by saving resources and playing it safe. I gave the following reasons for this. Players can quickly adapt to monsters the more often they're faced. Players boost their armor class with armor, spells, and magic items. Spells are effective at clearing the small amounts of damage that they do actually take. Players can always outlast these low-level enemies though. Players choose to save resources rather than quickly ending encounters. So I think that we have good standing to lay the blame of slow combats at the feet of hit point bloat. What all of this leads to is combats where 1 or 2 people can choose to stretch out the scenario way past an appropriate length of time, especially if you only play for a few hours in a given session. Now, if this isn't an issue in your games, no worries. I haven't spent a lot of time discussing proofs in this video or mechanical examples because I think this is a common enough problem, an explicit complaint to skip past the nonsense. Y'all can always look up what a gargoyle's 2-hit bonus is. It's +4. Damage, I think it's 1d6. Hit points, I think it's about 52, and compare it to the damage per round of someone in your party. Man, I should have just put those numbers in the script, huh? So here's how we got to my solution. I knew that the only reason high CR humanoids like Drow Inquisitors or Shadowblades had so many hit points was because adding lower level Drow to help, shore up the encounter wouldn't actually make the higher level critters more effective. I just needed the higher level stat blocks so that I could actually hit my players and deal more than 2d6 damage once in combat. So I take those stat blocks, I shave down the hit points so that none are above 50, field way more enemies in combat as a given result, and occasionally adjust the experience gained. My current players are between 8th and 11th level in 5th edition, and it's a West Marches campaign, setting the standard that regular enemies might deal high damage but will never take more than 50 hit points or so to take out as far as punishment is concerned, gives my players vital information on how the campaign handles combat. Most creatures they encounter in combat can actually hit them. When they do hit, they will deal damage that you'll notice, and encountering a lot of creatures at once means you have to use spells, men-at-arms, or flee to survive. Finally, making choices on which enemies to split up or focus down or remove from the scenario will have immediate consequences. In other words, the decisions players make in combat actually matter, because they produce different outcomes than beating on glorified training dummies. And if I really do feel the need to give certain enemies extra staying power, I have ways to keep them around without inflating hit points. Cloned bodies, consuming minions to recover hit points, multiple stages with individual health bars, conditions or objective that keep the boss from taking any damage at all, unique spells, you name it. The corpus of video games and tabletop games alike have more than enough resources to provide for edge cases. I don't need to ruin the foundation of my game, my campaign, in their favor. Turns out you can afford to worry way less about boss fights when basic combats don't suck. Well, we've arrived at the end, folks, and I'm filled with all sorts of pleasant thoughts and feelings about the future of this channel. We just passed 500 subscribers on the channel after all. This has grown a bit faster than I was initially expecting, and we're showing no signs of slowing down. If you would like to support the channel, be sure to subscribe, check out our Patreon at patreon.com/RubeJelly, and like the video. If you do stop by our Patreon, you'll see a handy chart for rejiggering monster hit points. I'd like to thank my patrons now, in fact. I'll be thanking Durian the Sleepy, Brandon D. Gullery, and of course Mijako. Now remember, some folks might object to you tinkering with monster hit points too often, or insisting that no, their boss monsters need to stick around longer, their combats don't last long enough. It's all nonsense. If you want to reach the 6th encounter day in 5th edition, the key is to throw a lot of monsters that are good at hitting, hit hard, but don't last terribly long in combat. That's all you need to remember. So, without further ado, peace, partner. Music was provided by Blue Dot Sessions, and a very hearty thank you to Mariana for the art.